Every morning at exactly 7:45, David walked through the doors of Lincoln Community College carrying the same worn backpack his older brother had used 3 years before. The strap was fraying at the edges, held together with safety pins that his mom had carefully placed to make it last another semester. Inside that backpack were 3 notebooks, 2 pens that still had ink, and a scientific calculator he'd bought used from a pawn shop for $12. David wasn't supposed to be in advanced calculus. At 17, most kids his age were taking regular math classes at the high school across town. But David had always been different when it came to numbers. They made sense to him in a way that nothing else did. When his guidance counselor mentioned a dual enrollment program that would let him take college classes, David jumped at the chance. What he didn't expect was how different he would feel sitting in a room full of older students who seemed to have everything figured out. The classroom was on the 3rd floor of the math building, and David always chose the same seat in the back corner by the window. From there, he could see the parking lot where shiny cars sat in neat rows. BMWs, Mercedes, even a few Teslas belonged to his classmates. David's mom dropped him off each morning in their 2008 Honda Civic that made a strange rattling sound when she turned left. She worked the early shift at the diner downtown, so she had to leave him 20 minutes before class started. David usually spent that time sitting on the steps outside, reviewing his notes and trying to calm the nervous feeling in his stomach. Professor Williams was a tall man with graying hair who had been teaching calculus for over 20 years. He had a way of explaining complex ideas that made them seem simple, but he also had little patience for students who didn't keep up. The class moved fast, covering material that most people found challenging. David loved every minute of it. While other students struggled with derivatives and integrals, David found himself thinking 3 steps ahead, seeing patterns that others missed. But being good at math didn't make the social part any easier. His classmates were mostly college sophomores and juniors who had grown up in the suburbs with tutors and expensive prep courses. They talked about spring break trips to Europe and internships at their parents' companies. They wore clothes that David recognized from store windows but had never owned. Their backpacks were new, their laptops were the latest models, and they seemed to move through the world with a confidence that David couldn't imagine having. There was Ashley, who always sat in the front row and asked detailed questions that showed she had done extra reading beyond the textbook. She drove a white BMW and carried a Louis Vuitton bag that probably cost more than David's family spent on groceries in 2 months. Then there was Tyler, who played on the college basketball team and somehow managed to balance sports with advanced mathematics. He was the kind of person who made everything look easy, from solving complex equations to making friends. The group that intimidated David the most sat in the middle of the classroom. They were all pre-med students who treated every assignment like it was a matter of life and death. They studied together at the library, shared notes, and seemed to have formed their own exclusive club. Rachel was their unofficial leader, a senior who had already been accepted to medical school and never let anyone forget it. She had a way of looking at David when he occasionally answered a question correctly, as if she was surprised he could speak at all. David's daily routine never changed. He would arrive early, sit in his corner seat, and pull out his materials without making eye contact with anyone. When Professor Williams asked questions, David usually knew the answers, but he rarely raised his hand. The few times he did speak up, his voice came out quieter than he intended, and he could feel everyone turning to look at the kid who didn't quite belong. At lunch, David ate alone in the student center. He brought sandwiches from home while other students bought expensive salads and coffee drinks. He would find a table in the corner and review his notes while listening to the conversations happening around him. They talked about parties he wasn't invited to, jobs their parents had helped them get, and study abroad programs that cost more than his family's rent. The hardest part wasn't the academic work. David could handle calculus problems that made other students panic. The hardest part was feeling invisible in a room full of people who seemed to have been born knowing how to navigate the world. They knew which professors to take, which study groups to join, and how to network with classmates who might help them later. David was figuring it all out as he went along, without a guidebook or anyone to ask for advice. His mom tried to understand when he talked about school over dinner. She would nod and smile when he explained a particularly interesting problem he had solved, but he could see the worry in her eyes. She had dropped out of high school when she got pregnant with David's older brother, and the world of college mathematics might as well have been a foreign country to her. She was proud of him. He knew that, but she also worried that he was setting himself up for disappointment by reaching so high above where they came from. David's older brother had taken a different path. He had graduated high school and immediately started working construction with their uncle. He made decent money and didn't have to sit in classrooms where he felt like an outsider. Sometimes David wondered if that would have been easier, but every time he solved a difficult problem or understood a concept that had initially seemed impossible, he remembered why he was putting himself through this discomfort. Numbers had always been his escape. When his parents fought about money, when his clothes didn't fit in at school, when he felt like he was watching everyone else's life through a window he couldn't open, math was the one place where none of that mattered. A derivative was a derivative whether you solved it in designer clothes or thrift store jeans. An integral didn't care about your zip code or your parents' education level. In the world of mathematics, David felt like he belonged. But belonging in the abstract world of numbers was different from belonging in a classroom full of people who seemed to have everything he didn't. Every day, David walked that line between his love for learning and his awareness of how different he was from everyone around him. He told himself it didn't matter, that he was there to learn, not to make friends. But deep down, he wondered if he would ever find a way to bridge the gap between who he was and who he needed to be to succeed in this world. The morning started like any other. David arrived 20 minutes early and sat on the steps outside the math building, reviewing his notes for the day's lesson on advanced integration techniques. The October air was crisp, and he could see his breath as he flipped through pages covered in his careful handwriting. He had spent the previous evening working through practice problems, and he felt confident about the material. When Professor Williams walked into the classroom at exactly 8 o'clock, he was carrying a stack of papers that made David's stomach drop. Pop quizzes were Professor Williams' way of keeping students on their toes, and they always seemed to happen when David least expected them. The professor had a theory that real understanding could only be tested when students couldn't prepare for days in advance. "Good morning, everyone," Professor Williams said, setting his briefcase down with a thud that echoed through the suddenly quiet classroom. "I hope you've been keeping up with the integration techniques we covered this week, because you're about to show me what you've learned." The collective groan from the class was audible. David watched as Ashley immediately pulled out her graphing calculator and set it precisely next to her pencil case. Tyler cracked his knuckles like he was preparing for a basketball game. The pre-med students exchanged glances that seemed to communicate an entire conversation without words. As Professor Williams walked down each row distributing the quiz papers, David reached into his backpack for his calculator. His fingers searched through the main compartment, then the smaller pockets, then back through everything again. His heart started beating faster as he realized what had happened. In his rush to help his mom with grocery shopping the night before, he had left his calculator on the kitchen table next to his math homework. The quiz paper landed on David's desk with questions that immediately confirmed his worst fears. These weren't simple integration problems that could be solved with mental math. They required complex calculations, graphing capabilities, and the kind of computational power that only a good calculator could provide. David stared at the first problem and felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool morning air. He looked around the classroom and saw everyone else already working, their calculators beeping softly as they input equations and generated graphs. David tried to solve the first problem by hand, but without a calculator to check his work or handle the more complex computations, he was essentially trying to build a house without tools. After 10 minutes of struggling, David made a decision that took every ounce of courage he could gather. He raised his hand slightly, hoping to catch Professor Williams' attention without drawing notice from his classmates. When that didn't work, he cleared his throat softly and raised his hand higher. "Professor Williams?" David's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. The professor looked up from his desk where he had been grading papers from another class. "Yes, David? I'm sorry, but I forgot my calculator this morning. Would it be possible to borrow one?" The question hung in the air for a moment that felt like an eternity. David could feel 20 pairs of eyes turning toward him, and the soft clicking and beeping of calculators suddenly seemed much louder. Professor Williams frowned, not in anger but in the way someone frowns when they encounter an unexpected problem. Before the professor could respond, Rachel's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "Are you serious right now?" She didn't bother to lower her voice or try to be discreet. How do you even take calculus without bringing a calculator? Tyler turned around in his seat to get a better look at the situation. Dude, that's like showing up to a basketball game without shoes. But it was Ashley who delivered the blow that made David wish he could disappear entirely. She let out a laugh that was loud enough for the entire class to hear, then said, "Maybe you should think about dropping down to basic algebra where you don't need one. I mean, if you can't even remember to bring the most important tool for the class, how are you supposed to handle college-level mathematics?" The laughter that followed wasn't mean-spirited from everyone, but it was widespread enough to make David feel like he was under a spotlight that was burning his skin. Some students tried to stifle their amusement, but others seemed genuinely entertained by the situation. David felt his face turning red, and he wished he could sink through the floor and disappear. Professor Williams finally spoke up, but his response only made things worse. "David, this is a significant oversight. Advanced calculus requires proper preparation and tools. Perhaps you should consider whether you're ready for the demands of this course." The professor's words weren't cruel, but they were spoken loudly enough for everyone to hear, and they carried an implication that hit David like a punch to the stomach. Here was the authority figure, the person whose opinion mattered most, suggesting that maybe David didn't belong in this classroom after all. "I understand that community college students sometimes face different challenges," Professor Williams continued, "but at this level of mathematics, everyone needs to be fully prepared for each class. The expectations don't change based on circumstances." David wanted to explain that he had never forgotten his calculator before, that he spent more time studying than probably anyone else in the room, that his understanding of the material was solid, even if his organizational skills had failed him this one time. But the words wouldn't come. His throat felt tight, and he was afraid that if he tried to speak, his voice might crack, or worse, he might start crying in front of everyone. Instead, he sat frozen in his seat while the quiz continued around him. Without a calculator, he could only complete about half of the problems, and even those answers he wasn't confident about. He watched the clock on the wall tick away the minutes, each second feeling like a small torture. When students started finishing and turning in their papers, David realized he had to make a choice. He could sit there until time was called and turn in a mostly blank paper, or he could turn in what little he had completed and try to salvage some dignity. He chose the latter, walking to the front of the classroom with his partially completed quiz while trying to ignore the looks from his classmates. As he placed the paper on Professor Williams's desk, he could hear whispered conversations, starting up behind him. "I can't believe he came to calculus without a calculator," someone said. "My little sister in middle school wouldn't forget something that basic." Another voice added, "Maybe he can't afford one." This comment was said with what might have been sympathy, but it somehow made David feel worse rather than better. The rest of the class period was devoted to reviewing the previous day's homework, but David couldn't concentrate on anything Professor Williams was saying. He sat in his corner seat feeling like everyone was still looking at him, still thinking about the kid who couldn't remember to bring a calculator to math class. The material that usually fascinated him seemed meaningless when filtered through the lens of his humiliation. When class finally ended, David was the first person out the door. He didn't wait to hear what grade he had received on the quiz, and he didn't stick around to listen to his classmates discuss their answers. He walked quickly down the hallway, down the stairs, and out of the building, not stopping until he reached the bus stop where he would wait for his mom to pick him up. Sitting on the bench with his backpack in his lap, David replayed the morning's events over and over in his mind. Each time he thought of something he could have said differently, some way he could have handled the situation that wouldn't have resulted in such complete embarrassment. But no matter how many times he replayed it, the outcome was the same. He had been exposed as someone who didn't belong, someone who couldn't even handle the basic requirements of being in that classroom. When his mom's Honda pulled up to the curb, David got in without saying hello. She immediately knew something was wrong from the look on his face, but she didn't push him to talk about it during the drive home. It wasn't until they were sitting at the kitchen table that evening, his forgotten calculator still sitting exactly where he had left it, that David finally told her what had happened. As he recounted the story, he could see the anger building in his mother's eyes. Not anger at him, but anger at the students who had laughed and the professor who had questioned his readiness for the class. But David didn't want her anger or her sympathy. What he wanted was a way to turn back time and make that morning never happen. 3 weeks had passed since the calculator incident, and David had developed a new routine. He arrived at class exactly on time instead of early, sat in his usual corner seat without making eye contact with anyone, and left immediately when Professor Williams dismissed them. He had stopped raising his hand to answer questions, even when he knew the solutions better than anyone else in the room. The spark that had once made mathematics exciting felt dimmed, like a light bulb that was slowly burning out. His grades hadn't suffered much. David still understood the material better than most of his classmates, and his homework assignments continued to earn high marks. But something fundamental had changed in how he approached the class. Where he once felt eager to engage with challenging problems, now he simply wanted to get through each session without drawing attention to himself. Professor Williams had noticed the change. A few times David caught him looking in his direction with what might have been concern, but David always looked away before any conversation could start. The last thing he wanted was another public discussion about whether he belonged in advanced calculus. On a Thursday morning in early November, Professor Williams walked into the classroom carrying something different than his usual stack of assignments and textbooks. In his hand was a single sheet of paper, and his expression was more serious than David had seen all semester. The professor set his materials down and turned to face the class with the kind of gravity usually reserved for announcing major exams or policy changes. "Before we begin today's lesson," Professor Williams said, "I want to share something unusual that came across my desk this week. The Regional Mathematics Consortium has been working on a problem that has been challenging some of the brightest minds in our field." Ashley immediately perked up in her front row seat. "Is this for extra credit, Professor Williams?" "No, this isn't about grades," the professor replied, walking toward the bulletin board at the side of the classroom. "This is about exposure to the kind of mathematics that exists beyond textbooks and standard curricula." David found himself paying attention despite his recent decision to keep a low profile. There was something in Professor Williams' tone that suggested this was different from their usual classroom activities. "What I'm about to show you is a problem that has been circulating among graduate programs at several universities," the professor continued, pinning the paper to the bulletin board. "Doctoral students in pure mathematics have been working on this for months. Some professors have been collaborating to try to find a solution." The paper looked innocuous enough from David's seat in the back corner. It appeared to be a single page with dense text and mathematical symbols, but David couldn't make out the details from his distance. What he could see was the way his classmates were reacting. Tyler was squinting at the board like he was trying to read something written in a foreign language. Rachel had pulled out her phone and was already taking pictures, probably planning to research it later. The problem involves advanced number theory combined with concepts from several areas of mathematics that most of you won't encounter until graduate school, Professor Williams explained. It has practical applications in cryptography and computer science, which is why there's been so much interest in solving it. He stepped aside so the class could see the paper more clearly. "I'm sharing this not because I expect anyone to solve it. That would be unrealistic given your current level of study. But I think it's valuable for you to see what mathematics looks like at the cutting edge of research." David felt a familiar stirring of curiosity that he hadn't experienced since the calculator incident. Even from his seat in the back, he could see that the problem was filled with the kind of elegant mathematical relationships that had always fascinated him. There were summations, complex variables, and what looked like modular arithmetic expressions that created patterns within patterns. "Can we get copies of this?" Rachel asked, her competitive instincts clearly activated by the mention of graduate-level mathematics. "I'll leave this posted here for the remainder of the semester," Professor Williams replied. "Anyone who's interested can take a closer look after class or during office hours. But remember, this isn't a homework assignment. This is a research problem that's currently unsolved." Ashley raised her hand. "Has anyone come close to solving it?" "There have been some partial approaches," the professor said. "A team at State University made some progress on one aspect of the proof, and researchers at the Technical Institute developed a computational method that works for specific cases. But a complete general solution has remained elusive." As Professor Williams transitioned into the day's planned lesson on advanced integration by parts, David found his attention repeatedly drifting back to the paper on the bulletin board. He couldn't read the specific details from his seat, but something about the structure of the problem intrigued him. It reminded him of puzzles he had enjoyed solving as a child, but infinitely more complex and sophisticated. The rest of the class period felt longer than usual. David took notes on the integration techniques Professor Williams was demonstrating, but his mind kept wandering to the research problem. He found himself sketching small diagrams in the margins of his notebook, trying to visualize what kinds of mathematical relationships might be involved in a problem that had stumped graduate students and professors. When class ended, David didn't rush out the door as he had been doing for the past 3 weeks. Instead, he waited until most of his classmates had left, then approached the bulletin board to get a closer look at the problem. What he saw there made his pulse quicken in a way that surprised him. The problem was written in formal mathematical language, but as David read through it carefully, he began to understand what was being asked. It involved proving certain properties of prime numbers when arranged in specific patterns, combined with concepts from modular arithmetic and algebraic structures. The notation was advanced, but the underlying logic wasn't completely foreign to him. More importantly, David noticed something that sparked his interest. The problem was structured in a way that reminded him of work he had done independently, reading mathematics books from the library that went far beyond what was covered in class. He had always been drawn to number theory, spending hours exploring patterns in prime numbers and mathematical sequences that most people his age never encountered. Interesting, isn't it? Professor Williams' voice startled David, who hadn't realized the professor was still in the classroom. David turned around, momentarily panicked that he was about to be questioned about why he was lingering after class. "Yes, sir. It looks very complex." "It is," Professor Williams agreed, walking over to stand beside David in front of the bulletin board. "The beauty of mathematics is that sometimes the most elegant solutions come from unexpected approaches. Traditional methods don't always work for problems like this." There was something in the professor's tone that made David think he was being told something important, but he wasn't sure what it was. Was Professor Williams encouraging him to attempt the problem? That seemed unlikely given their recent interactions. "Have any students ever worked on research problems like this?" David asked, surprising himself with his boldness. "Not often at the undergraduate level," Professor Williams replied. "It requires a combination of technical knowledge, creative thinking, and persistence that's relatively rare. Most students prefer to focus on material that's directly related to their coursework and grades." David nodded and started to gather his materials, assuming the conversation was over. But as he turned to leave, Professor Williams spoke again. "David, I know the past few weeks have been challenging for you in this class, but I hope you remember that mathematical ability isn't measured by whether you remember to bring a calculator. It's measured by how you think about problems and whether you can see patterns that others miss." The comment caught David off guard. He had assumed that Professor Williams saw him as just another struggling student who might not be ready for advanced mathematics. But there was something in the professor's words that suggested a different perspective. As David walked out of the classroom and down the hallway, he couldn't stop thinking about the problem on the bulletin board. For the first time in 3 weeks, he felt genuinely excited about mathematics again. The humiliation of the calculator incident hadn't disappeared, but it had been temporarily overshadowed by curiosity about something that seemed almost impossible to solve. That evening, David couldn't concentrate on his regular homework assignments. He kept thinking about the research problem, trying to remember the specific details of how it was structured. Finally, he decided to return to the math building the next morning before class to take another look at it. When he arrived at the classroom 30 minutes early, David was surprised to find that he wasn't alone. Rachel was standing in front of the bulletin board with a notebook, carefully copying the problem word for word. When she saw David enter the room, she looked slightly embarrassed, as if she had been caught doing something she wasn't supposed to be doing. "Just wanted to take another look," she said defensively. "Not that I think I can solve it or anything. I'm just curious about how graduate-level problems are structured." David nodded and waited for her to finish. When Rachel left, he approached the bulletin board and read through the problem again, this time more slowly and carefully. As he studied the mathematical notation, he began to see connections and patterns that hadn't been obvious during his first reading. Ideas started forming in his mind about possible approaches, unconventional methods that might work where traditional techniques had failed. For the first time since the calculator incident, David felt like himself again. He was excited about mathematics, eager to explore ideas that pushed beyond the boundaries of what he was supposed to know. The research problem represented everything he loved about math. It was challenging, elegant, and completely indifferent to his social status or financial situation. Numbers didn't care about designer clothes or expensive calculators. They only cared about logic, creativity, and persistence. David's obsession with the research problem began innocently enough. He started by copying it down word for word in his notebook, then spending his free time between classes trying to understand each component. The problem involved something called the Riemann hypothesis applied to a specific class of prime numbers, combined with modular arithmetic in ways that created what mathematicians call elegant complications. During his lunch breaks, instead of sitting alone in the student center, David found himself walking to the library. Lincoln Community College's library wasn't impressive by university standards, but it had a decent mathematics section that David had been exploring since his first week of classes. Now he had a specific mission, understanding every concept referenced in the research problem. The first week was frustrating. David would look up one concept only to discover it required knowledge of 3 other concepts he didn't understand. It was like trying to climb a mountain where each step revealed that the peak was actually much higher than he had originally thought. But David had always been patient with mathematics. He understood that real learning happened slowly, one small piece at a time. He started carrying a second notebook dedicated entirely to the research problem. In it, he wrote definitions, theorems, and examples that might be relevant. He drew diagrams trying to visualize the mathematical relationships described in the problem. Most importantly, he began to see patterns that weren't immediately obvious from a casual reading. The breakthrough came during his second week of intensive study. David was sitting in the library's mathematics section, surrounded by textbooks on number theory and algebraic structures, when he realized that everyone might be approaching the problem in the same way. The traditional methods that graduate students and professors would naturally try all assumed certain computational approaches that, while mathematically sound, were incredibly complex. But what if there was a simpler path? David had always been drawn to what mathematicians call elegant solutions, approaches that solve complex problems through insights rather than brute force calculations. He remembered reading about famous mathematical proofs that were beautiful, not because they were complicated, but because they revealed simple truths hidden within apparent complexity. That night, David stayed at the library until closing time. He had discovered something in an obscure journal article from the 1960s that most people probably hadn't read in decades. The article described a theorem about prime number distributions that seemed completely unrelated to the research problem at first glance. But as David studied it more carefully, he began to see connections that might provide a shortcut to the solution everyone else was seeking. The next few days blurred together. David would attend his regular classes, but his mind was constantly working on the research problem. He carried his notebook everywhere, scribbling ideas during breaks and connecting concepts in ways that surprised even him. His understanding of mathematics was expanding rapidly as he encountered advanced topics that weren't part of any standard curriculum. His mom noticed the change in his behavior. David had always been studious, but now he seemed completely absorbed in something that went beyond normal homework. He would sit at the kitchen table after dinner, covering pages with calculations and diagrams that looked like a foreign language to her. When she asked about it, David tried to explain, but he could see that the mathematics he was working with was too abstract for someone without his background to understand. Just be careful not to burn yourself out, she warned one evening as David prepared to head back to the library for another late-night study session. You're 17 years old. You shouldn't be working this hard. But David couldn't stop. For the first time in his life, he was working on something that felt truly important. This wasn't homework that would be graded and forgotten. This was research that, if successful, could contribute to mathematical knowledge in a meaningful way. The possibility that he might solve something that had stumped graduate students and professors was intoxicating. The real breakthrough came on a Friday night when David was alone in the library's mathematics section. Most students were out at parties or social events, but David preferred the quiet environment where he could think without distractions. He had been working on a particular aspect of the problem for hours, trying to apply the theorem he had discovered to the specific conditions outlined in the research problem. Suddenly, The pieces began falling into place in a way that made David's heart race. The theorem from the 1960s journal article didn't just apply to the research problem, it provided a direct path to the solution that bypassed all the computational complexity that was making the problem seem impossible. Instead of requiring advanced computer calculations and months of collaborative work, the solution could be elegant and concise. David spent the next 3 hours working feverishly, checking and double-checking his logic. He used every theorem and proof technique he had learned, plus several he had taught himself during his weeks of intensive study. By the time the library's closing announcement came over the intercom, David had filled 12 pages with what he believed was a complete solution to the research problem. But he didn't trust himself. This was too important to get wrong, and David knew that mathematical proofs required careful verification. He had heard stories of mathematicians who thought they had solved famous problems only to discover errors in their work later. David wasn't going to make that mistake. He spent the entire weekend reviewing his solution, looking for logical gaps or computational errors. He approached it from different angles, trying to find alternative methods that would either confirm or contradict his approach. Every time he checked his work, the solution seemed solid. More than solid, it was elegant in a way that made David proud of the mathematical thinking he had developed. On Monday morning, David arrived at Professor Williams' office an hour before the professor's posted office hours began. He sat in the hallway with his notebook, reviewing his solution one final time and preparing for what might be the most important conversation of his academic life. When Professor Williams arrived, carrying his usual coffee and briefcase, he seemed surprised to find David waiting outside his office. "David, you're here early. Is everything all right with the coursework?" "Professor Williams, I think I might have something to show you," David said, his voice steadier than he felt. "It's about the research problem you posted in class." Professor Williams paused in the process of unlocking his office door. "The research problem? David, I appreciate your interest, but that's graduate-level mathematics. I shared it as an example of advanced research, not as an assignment." "I understand," David replied, "but I've been studying it for the past few weeks, and I think I might have found an approach that works." The professor's expression shifted from polite concern to genuine curiosity. "An approach that works? David, doctoral students have been working on this problem for months." "I know," David said. "That's what makes me think I might be wrong. But I've checked my work multiple times and I can't find any errors." Professor Williams opened his office door and gestured for David to enter. "Show me what you found." David opened his notebook to the pages containing his solution. As Professor Williams read through the mathematical reasoning, David watched his expression change from skeptical interest to focused concentration to something that looked like amazement. "David, where did you learn about Hartwell's theorem on prime distributions?" Professor Williams asked, pointing to a specific section of the proof. "I found it in a journal article from 1967, David replied. "Most of the sources I found online didn't mention it, but I thought it might be relevant." Professor Williams continued reading, occasionally asking questions about specific steps in the proof. David answered each question confidently, explaining his reasoning and showing how each piece of the solution connected to the others. When Professor Williams finally looked up from the notebook, his expression was one that David had never seen before. It wasn't the polite encouragement of a teacher trying to boost a student's confidence. It was the genuine respect of one mathematician for another's work. "David, I need to make some phone calls," Professor Williams said slowly. "I need to have some colleagues review this work. But if what you've done here is correct, and I believe it might be, you've solved a problem that's been puzzling some very smart people for a very long time." As David walked out of Professor Williams's office that morning, he felt something he had never experienced before. It wasn't just pride in solving a difficult problem. It was the recognition that he might actually belong in the world of advanced mathematics, not despite his background, but because of the unique perspective it had given him. The phone call came on a Wednesday afternoon, while David was working his part-time job at the grocery store. His mom answered, and David could tell from her tone that something unusual was happening. When he got home that evening, she was sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper covered in her careful handwriting. "Professor Williams called," she said, looking both excited and confused. "He wants you to call him back immediately. He said something about your mathematics work being reviewed by people at the university." David's stomach jumped. It had been a week since he had shown Professor Williams his solution to the research problem, and he had been trying not to think about it too much. Part of him worried that the professor had found errors in his work, or worse, that David had completely misunderstood what the problem was asking for. When David called Professor Williams that evening, the professor's voice sounded different than it ever had in class. There was an excitement there that David had never heard before. "David, I've spent the last week sharing your work with colleagues at 3 different universities," Professor Williams said. "I sent your proof to Dr. Henderson at State University, who specializes in number theory, and to the mathematics department at the Technical Institute. I also shared it with Dr. Chen at Metropolitan University, who has been working on related problems for her research." David felt his heart beating faster. "What did they say?" "They're amazed," Professor Williams replied. "Dr. Henderson called me this morning to say that your approach is not only correct, but that it's more elegant than anything his graduate students have produced. Dr. Chen wants to know if you've considered publishing your work." Publishing? David had never imagined that anything he did with mathematics could be important enough to publish. Publishing was something that professors and graduate students did, not 17-year-old community college students who forgot to bring calculators to class. "There's more," Professor Williams continued. "Dr. Henderson wants to meet with you next week, and Dr. Chen has asked if she can share your work with her colleagues who are working on similar problems." "David, do you understand what this means?" David wasn't sure he did understand. The world of academic mathematics was completely foreign to him. He knew that professors conducted research and published papers, but he had never imagined himself as part of that world. The meeting with Dr. Henderson took place the following Tuesday in his office at State University. David's mom drove him there, and they both marveled at the campus with its impressive buildings and manicured lawns. David felt underdressed in his khakis and button-down shirt, but Dr. Henderson greeted him with the kind of respect usually reserved for fellow academics. "David, I've been working on problems related to your research for the past 5 years," Dr. Henderson said, as they sat in his office surrounded by mathematical textbooks and journals. "What you've accomplished in a few weeks is remarkable, not just because you solved the problem, but because of how you solved it." Dr. Henderson explained that David's approach was fundamentally different from what other researchers had attempted. While most mathematicians had been trying to solve the problem through computational methods that required extensive computer calculations, David had found a path that relied on mathematical insight and elegant reasoning. "The theorem you applied from Hartwell's 1967 paper is something that most contemporary researchers had overlooked," Dr. Henderson continued. "It takes a special kind of mathematical intuition to see those connections." Over the next hour, Dr. B. Henderson walked David through the process of academic publication. He explained how mathematical research was reviewed by other experts in the field, how papers were submitted to journals, and how successful publication could open doors to opportunities that David had never considered. "I'd like to work with you to prepare your proof for submission to the Journal of Number Theory," Dr. Henderson said. "It's one of the most respected publications in our field. With some additional documentation and formal presentation, your work could be published within 6 months." The conversation felt surreal to David. 6 months ago, he had been a high school student taking community college classes to challenge himself. Now he was being told that his mathematical work was worthy of publication in a prestigious academic journal. The transformation in David's status at Lincoln Community College was immediate and dramatic. When Professor Williams announced to the class that David had solved the research problem, the reaction was unlike anything David had ever experienced. Ashley, who had laughed at him for forgetting his calculator, stared at him with an expression of complete disbelief. Tyler turned around in his seat to look at David as if seeing him for the first time. But it was Rachel's reaction that surprised David the most. After class, she approached him with what appeared to be genuine respect rather than the condescension he had grown accustomed to. "David, I owe you an apology," she said. "I've been assuming that because you're younger and come from a different background, you weren't as serious about mathematics as the rest of us. I was completely wrong." The apology meant more to David than he expected it would. He had told himself that his classmates' opinions didn't matter, but being recognized by them as an equal felt like healing a wound he hadn't realized was still painful. The publication process took longer than Dr. Henderson had originally estimated, but David didn't mind. Working with university professors to refine his proof and prepare it for publication was the most educational experience of his life. He learned about the standards of academic mathematics, the importance of rigorous documentation, and the collaborative nature of mathematical research. When the Journal of Number Theory accepted David's paper for publication, the news spread quickly through the academic community. David began receiving emails from professors at universities across the country who wanted to discuss his work. Some invited him to visit their campuses. Others asked if he had considered applying to their graduate programs, even though David was still finishing his senior year of high school. The attention was overwhelming at first, but Professor Williams helped David navigate the opportunities that were being presented to him. Together, they researched universities with strong mathematics programs and professors whose research aligned with David's interests. The most important thing to remember, Professor Williams told him during one of their regular meetings, is that this success doesn't change who you are. You've always had this mathematical ability. What's changed is that other people are finally recognizing it. The college application process was unlike anything David's family had ever experienced. While his classmates were applying to regional universities and hoping for partial scholarships, David was being recruited by some of the most prestigious mathematics programs in the country. The boy who had once worried about affording a used calculator was now being offered full scholarships to institutions that most students could only dream of attending. When the acceptance letter from MIT arrived, David's mom cried for the first time since he had started taking college mathematics classes. She had always believed in his potential, but seeing that potential recognized by one of the world's leading universities was more than she had dared to hope for. The final day of David's calculus class at Lincoln Community College was emotional in ways he hadn't expected. Professor Williams presented him with a copy of the published journal article containing his proof, along with a letter of recommendation that would help him transition to university mathematics. "David, you've taught me something important this semester," Professor Williams said in front of the entire class. "Mathematical talent isn't always packaged the way we expect it to be. Sometimes it comes quietly from unexpected places and surprises everyone involved." As David cleaned out his corner desk for the last time, Ashley approached him with something that looked like humility. "I wanted to say thank you," she said. "Watching you work on that research problem taught me that being successful in mathematics isn't about having the right equipment or coming from the right background. It's about persistence and seeing things differently than everyone else." David nodded, accepting the apology he had never asked for but was grateful to receive. Years later, when Dr. David Lee was conducting his own research at a prestigious university and mentoring students who reminded him of his younger self, he would keep that first published paper framed in his office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that mathematical ability can emerge from anywhere, and that the quiet student in the back corner might be the one who changes everything. The calculator incident, which had once felt like the most humiliating moment of his academic life, became something different in David's memory. It became the moment when he learned that real mathematical power comes not from the tools you can afford, but from the way you think about problems and your willingness to persist when others give up. And sometimes, just sometimes, that persistence leads to discoveries that surprise everyone, including yourself.